He adapts faster than you, my boss sneered, not even looking up from his phone. I nodded politely. 2 days later, he barged into my cubicle screaming, "Why did the entire team stall out?" If you've ever been erased from something you created, if you've ever watched someone take credit for your architecture while simultaneously destroying it, stay with me. What happened next isn't about revenge. It's about understanding exactly what you're worth, documenting it, and watching systems reveal their own fragility. And if this resonates, share your story in the comments. We're all navigating these power games, and every blueprint helps someone else find their way out. I'd been at Century Technologies for 4 years by then. Senior Systems Architect. The kind of role where you arrive before the sun touches the downtown skyline and leave after the cleaning crew starts their rounds. My desk sat in the southeast corner of the 4th floor, overlooking a construction site that had been perpetually almost finished for the past 18 months. I had a succulent on my desk, a tiny jade plant someone gave me during my first week. It had tripled in size, thick with new leaves, thriving under the fluorescent lights and irregular watering schedule. The integration platform I built connected 17 legacy systems across 3 continents. Purchase orders, inventory, invoicing, customer data, all flowing through pathways I'd mapped, tested, and hardened over nearly a year. I knew every API endpoint, every database table, every failure mode and recovery sequence. The architecture wasn't flashy. It was resilient. When vendors changed their data formats without warning, my system adapted. When a server farm in Frankfurt went offline during a storm, traffic rerouted through Dublin within 40 seconds. When the finance team needed emergency reports at 3 a.m. before a board meeting, the data was already there, formatted and accurate. Nobody asked me to document it the way I did. But I'm careful by nature. So I kept architecture diagrams updated in real time, color-coded by dependency level and criticality. I maintained a private repository with every decision log, every edge case, every workaround for vendor inconsistencies. I wrote deployment procedures that could guide someone through the entire stack, step by step, assuming they had the foundational knowledge. I even created video walkthroughs for the most complex procedures, not because anyone requested them, but because I believed in leaving things better than I found them. The system hummed. Quiet. Reliable. Invisible, the way good infrastructure should be. I'd wake up sometimes at 2 a.m. to check my phone, making sure no alerts had fired. My friends thought I was obsessive. Maybe I was. But when you build something from scratch, when you know every bolt and wire, you feel responsible for it. It becomes part of you. The conference room had gray walls and a view of the parking garage. My manager, Stuart Vaughn, sat across from me with his arms crossed. He was the kind of leader who spoke in corporate jargon and metrics without ever asking how things actually worked. In 4 years, he'd never once asked to see my code or understand the platform's architecture. He just wanted uptime percentages and cost projections for his quarterly reviews. Beside him sat the new hire, a guy named Colin Marsh who'd been with the company for 6 weeks. Colin had been brought in at a director level, 2 rungs above me, with a mandate to accelerate digital transformation. He'd worked at a consulting firm before this, the kind that charged $500 an hour to tell companies what their own employees had been saying for years. He used phrases like agile pivots and disruptive ideation. He wore expensive blazers with casual jeans, trying to signal that he was both serious and creative. He referenced consulting frameworks I'd never heard of, McKinsey matrices and Bain methodologies that sounded impressive but meant nothing in the context of actual systems architecture. Stuart slid a folder across the table. "We're transitioning the integration platform to Colin's oversight," he said flatly. "He'll be taking point on the next phase. You'll shift to support and documentation." Support and documentation. Translation, Sidelined. The folder contained a single page, an organizational chart showing Colin's name in a box above mine, with a dotted line labeled Technical Advisory Capacity. My title hadn't changed, but my autonomy had evaporated. "The platform is stable," I said carefully, keeping my voice even. "We're ahead of schedule for the quarterly milestones. Client satisfaction scores are at 96%. We haven't had a critical incident in 7 months. It's not about stability, Olivia." Stuart finally looked at me, his expression impatient. "It's about vision. Colin has executive presence. He understands how to communicate value upward. The board wants someone who can speak their language, someone who can present at investor meetings. Colin leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly. His expression was sympathetic but condescending, like a parent explaining something obvious to a child. No hard feelings, he said. You built a solid foundation. Really solid. But foundations need structures built on top of them, and that requires a different skill set. I'm just better positioned to take it to the next level. You understand. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Not panic. Not even anger yet. Just clarity. I'd seen this pattern before, at previous jobs, in conversations with colleagues from other companies. The quiet person who builds something essential gets replaced by the loud person who knows how to sell it. The engineer becomes the footnote while the consultant becomes the visionary. I nodded politely, gathered the folder, and walked out. My hands were steady. My expression was neutral. But inside, something had shifted. A decision was forming, still wordless, still abstract, but gaining weight with every step back to my desk. I went home that night and sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, staring at the city lights. The apartment was quiet. I'd lived there for 3 years, a one-bedroom in a neighborhood that was slowly gentrifying, where coffee shops kept replacing hardware stores and rent kept climbing. The balcony was small, barely large enough for a chair and a potted herb garden that I kept forgetting to water. But the view was good. You could see downtown, the towers lit up like a circuit board, energy flowing through structured pathways. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed late fixing problems no one else knew existed. The Saturday I'd spent tracking down a memory leak that was degrading performance by 2%, not enough for anyone to notice immediately, but enough to cause failures under peak load. The Sunday morning I'd driven to the office because a vendor had changed their API without notice, and I needed to patch the integration before Monday's transaction batches ran. My phone buzzed. A text from my friend Diane, an employment attorney I'd met at a professional development workshop 2 years earlier. We'd stayed in touch, trading book recommendations and occasionally meeting for coffee. She was sharp, direct, and had once told me that the biggest mistake talented people make is undervaluing their own leverage. How's the integration beast treating you? I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed out what happened, my thumbs moving quickly across the screen, translating the afternoon's humiliation into clean, factual sentences. Her response came fast. Call me. Now. Diane didn't waste time on sympathy. Do you have documentation? She asked. Everything. Architecture specs, decision logs, deployment guides, code repositories. I have commit histories showing every change I made, timestamped and annotated. I have email threads where I warned about specific risks and proposed solutions. I have meeting notes from design reviews. Contracts? Intellectual property agreements? I paused, pulling up the file on my laptop. I signed the standard employment agreement when I started. It has a broad IP clause saying anything I create in the course of employment belongs to the company. But the platform was built using open-source frameworks and internal libraries I wrote before this project even started. Some of those libraries came from personal projects I'd been developing for years. My personal repository includes work I did off hours, refining algorithms and building test environments on my own hardware. I could hear Diane typing on her end. Did you ever sign a specific agreement transferring those personal libraries to Century Technologies? No. I just incorporated them into the platform. I didn't think about it as separate. They needed certain functionality, and I had code that already solved those problems, so I used it. Diane was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, sharper, more focused. Olivia, do you understand what you just told me? That I worked too much for free? That you own leverage, she said. If the company's core integration depends on systems you designed, libraries you authored, and procedures only you understand in depth, and if Colin doesn't actually know how any of it works, then you're not sidelined. You're the foundation they just decided to ignore. She explained it carefully, the way she'd probably explained it to dozens of clients before me. If Century Technologies wanted to continue using certain proprietary methods I'd developed outside the scope of my employment agreement, they'd need explicit licensing agreements. If Colin tried to modify the architecture without understanding the dependencies, failures would cascade. And if those failures impacted revenue or compliance, the company would be desperate to stabilize things quickly. Here's what you do, Diane said. Document every request they make from this point forward. Every question, every access demand, every time they ask for your help after cutting you out. Save every email. Record every conversation if it's legal in your state, and it is. And don't volunteer anything. If they want your knowledge, they negotiate for it. I felt the cold clarity deepen, spreading through my chest like frost on a window. What happens if I do nothing? Then you watch Colin learn the hard way what happens when someone dismantles something they don't understand. And when the company comes crawling back, and they will, you'll have all the documentation you need to set your own terms. I'd kept meticulous records. Not out of paranoia, just habit. Every project has a history, and history matters when you're troubleshooting at 2 a.m. and need to remember why a particular configuration exists. But now I realized those records were a map of dependencies, a blueprint showing exactly where the platform was fragile and where it was reinforced. The integration platform wasn't just code. It was a web of delicate timing sequences, vendor API quirks, and database transaction patterns that had taken months to stabilize. I'd built automated monitoring, yes, with dashboards showing real-time metrics and alert thresholds. But I'd also built manual override protocols that required specific access credentials and procedural knowledge, the kind of knowledge that doesn't fit neatly into documentation because it comes from experience, from watching patterns emerge over hundreds of transactions. Colin had the admin passwords. He had the source code. He had access to the wiki and the official documentation. But he didn't have the manual. Because the manual, the real one, not the sanitized version in the company wiki, lived in my private repository. It was 347 pages long. It included not just procedures but explanations of why those procedures existed, what failures they prevented, and what edge cases they handled. Every time I'd updated the platform, I'd updated that manual, treating it as a living document that evolved with the system. Century Technologies depended on 17 synchronized systems processing $40 million in transactions per week. The platform handled invoicing for clients in 6 countries, each with different regulatory requirements, currency conversions, and data format expectations. It reconciled purchase orders with inventory systems, matched payments with invoices, generated compliance reports for auditors in 3 different regulatory frameworks. One configuration error could cascade across continents. I'd seen it happen once during testing. A single incorrect timestamp format in the European subsystem had caused invoice mismatches that took 3 days to untangle. I spent the weekend organizing my documentation. Not to weaponize it, just to understand exactly what I controlled. I made copies. I secured backups in 3 separate locations, encrypted cloud storage, an external hard drive in a safe deposit box, and printed copies stored at Diane's office. I reviewed my employment contract line by line with Diane on a video call, highlighting every ambiguous clause about intellectual property and development timelines. We found 7 areas where my personal code had been integrated into the platform: algorithms for data normalization, error handling routines, performance optimization scripts. I'd developed all of them on my own time, using my own equipment, before the integration project had even been proposed. Then I waited. Colin started making changes on day 3. I heard about it through a Slack message from one of the junior developers, a kid named Felix who I'd been mentoring for the past year. "Hey, Colin just pushed a config update to production. Did you review it?" I hadn't. I opened the commit log and felt my stomach tighten. He'd restructured the database connection pooling, eliminating what he called redundant fallback protocols that were slowing performance by approximately 40 milliseconds per transaction. Those weren't redundant. They were safeguards for when European vendors experienced latency spikes during peak hours. Without them, connections would time out instead of queuing, and transactions would fail silently instead of retrying. I'd implemented them after an incident 18 months ago when a network issue in Amsterdam had caused 12 hours of transaction losses before anyone noticed. I pulled up the monitoring dashboard and watched. Traffic was normal, mid-morning in the US, afternoon in Europe. Nothing stressed the system yet. I didn't say anything. 12 hours later, the platform stalled during a routine invoicing batch. European transactions queued up, then timed out. Alerts fired across the operations channel like fireworks. Colin's name was all over the commit history, flagged in red by the automated systems that tracked production changes. He rolled back the change within 20 minutes. The backlog cleared. No data was lost, but 4,000 invoices had been delayed by 6 hours. Minor hiccup, he announced in a company-wide email. We're optimizing for scale. Growing pains are expected when you're pushing systems forward. Everything is stable now. I watched from my desk, sipping tea, saying nothing. Felix messaged me privately. That was the fallback protocol you built, wasn't it? The one he removed? Yep. Should we say something? No. Let him learn. Week 2 brought bigger problems. Colin decided the vendor API integration was over-engineered and rewrote the authentication layer to use a simpler OAuth 2.0 flow. He'd been reading about modern API design, apparently, and thought our system was outdated. The new code looked cleaner, more elegant. It followed current best practices from Google and Microsoft's API guidelines. But 3 of our oldest vendors, companies that had been clients for over a decade, didn't support OAuth 2.0. Their systems were ancient, running on infrastructure that hadn't been updated since 2012. I'd built a hybrid authentication system specifically to accommodate them, OAuth 2.0 for modern vendors, OAuth 1.0a for legacy systems, and even basic HTTP authentication for one particularly stubborn vendor who refused to upgrade anything. It wasn't elegant. It was a patchwork solution held together with adapter code and translation layers. But it worked. Colin's new code went live on a Monday morning during our weekly deployment window. By Monday afternoon, purchase orders from those 3 vendors stopped processing. Inventory data froze. Customer service started receiving calls from confused clients asking why their orders showed as pending when they should have shipped days ago. The ops team pinged me, Olivia, what's happening with the vendor sync? Orders from Westfield Supply, Harman Industries, and Pacific Distribution all stopped. I replied politely, I'm no longer on that project. Please check with Colin. Colin spent 2 days diagnosing the issue. I watched him in the engineering channel, demanding answers from the junior developers, blaming vendor APIs for being non-compliant with modern standards, insisting the old authentication method was deprecated and insecure. He escalated tickets to the vendors, asking them to upgrade their systems immediately. The vendors, predictably, said no. Their systems worked fine with dozens of other clients. If Century Technologies wanted to do business with them, we needed to support their authentication protocols. Finally, someone pulled up my original implementation notes from the wiki, a 40-page document I'd written explaining the authentication architecture and why each vendor required a different approach. Olivia documented this. 3 vendors use legacy auth. Hybrid layer required. She even included the vendor contact information and their technical specifications. Colin didn't acknowledge it publicly. He just quietly rebuilt the hybrid system, badly, and pushed it live. It worked, but barely. The error logging was broken, so we couldn't see when authentication failed. The failover logic was missing, so if one vendor's API went down, the entire authentication module would crash instead of routing around the problem. And the retry mechanism was configured incorrectly, causing the system to spam vendors with repeated requests instead of backing off gracefully. I said nothing. But I took screenshots of every error, every failed transaction, every panicked Slack message. I saved them in a folder labeled Timeline. By week 4, Century Technologies had a reputation problem. 2 major clients, a manufacturing company and a retail chain, reported delayed invoices that were affecting their quarterly close processes. A compliance audit flagged data discrepancies in European transactions, suggesting that our system might not be properly handling GDPR requirements. The platform's uptime metrics, previously at 99.7%, had dropped to 94%. Our SLA agreements guaranteed 99.5%. Customer service was overwhelmed. The ops team was working 16-hour days trying to manually reconcile transactions. Felix looked exhausted every time I saw him, dark circles under his eyes. Colin keeps saying we need to rebuild the entire platform, he told me quietly one afternoon. He says your architecture is fundamentally flawed. What do you think? I asked. Felix hesitated. I think he doesn't understand how the pieces fit together. He sees something that looks inefficient and changes it without asking why it was built that way. And every time he changes something, 3 other things break. Keep documenting everything, I said. Every change, every failure, every recovery. You'll need that record. Stewart called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but I heard about it from multiple sources. The entire leadership team was there, the CFO, the COO, the head of product, the head of sales. Colin gave a presentation explaining that the platform's problems stemmed from technical debt accumulated during the initial development. He showed slides with scary-looking metrics, lines of code, cyclomatic complexity, dependency graphs. He argued that the system needed a complete architectural overhaul. How long would that take? The CFO asked. 6 months, Colin said confidently. Maybe 8. We'd need to hire additional engineers, bring in specialized contractors. But at the end, we'd have a modern, scalable platform built on microservices architecture with containerized deployment and cloud-native infrastructure. The buzzwords hung in the air, impressive and empty. What would that cost? The CFO pressed. Approximately $2.3 million for personnel and infrastructure. But the ROI would be significant. We could reduce operational costs by 30% within a year. The room went silent. Century Technologies couldn't survive 6 months of unstable invoicing. Clients were already threatening to leave. The board was asking uncomfortable questions. And $2.3 million was a significant fraction of the IT budget for the entire year. The COO asked the question that changed everything: can we stabilize the current system while planning the rebuild? Colin hesitated. It would be challenging. The person who built it didn't document certain implementation details adequately. That's when Stewart came to my desk. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled. He stood awkwardly at the edge of my cubicle, not quite meeting my eyes. Olivia, we need your help stabilizing the platform. I looked up from my monitor, where I'd been reading a technical article about database optimization. I thought Colin had it under control. He's still learning the nuances. Stewart's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his skin. The system is more complex than we initially understood. We need you to consult. Temporarily. Just until we smooth things out. Consult, I repeated slowly, tasting the word. Yes. We'll compensate you for the extra hours. Time and a half for anything beyond your normal 40 hours. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. Stewart shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Stewart, I built that platform. I know every dependency, every failure mode, every undocumented quirk. I know which vendors require special handling, which database queries need optimization, which error conditions require manual intervention. I documented all of this extensively, but the real knowledge, the deep understanding of how everything interconnects, that's in here. I tapped my temple. If you want me to fix what's broken, we need to talk about terms. His face flushed. Terms? Intellectual property rights for the proprietary libraries I developed. Back pay for the off-hours work that built those systems. And a formal agreement outlining my role, my authority, and my compensation going forward. You can't be serious. I met his eyes. I'm very serious. Colin has been making changes for 4 weeks. In that time, system uptime has dropped by 5.7 percentage points. Client satisfaction has dropped 14 points. You've had 3 SLA violations. 2 clients are threatening to terminate their contracts. And last week, your stock price dropped 3% after an analyst report mentioned operational challenges. Stewart's face went pale. How do you know about the analyst report? I read. And I pay attention. I pulled up a spreadsheet on my monitor. Here's what it will cost you if I don't help: estimated $8 million in lost revenue over the next quarter from client departures. Another $2.3 million for Colin's rebuild, which has maybe a 30% chance of succeeding given his current understanding of the requirements. Legal exposure from SLA violations, conservatively $500,000. Reputational damage that will affect your ability to win new clients for at least 2 years. I turned the monitor so he could see the numbers. My terms are reasonable compared to that. And they're non-negotiable. You're bluffing. We sat in her office, a small but well-appointed space in a building downtown. Law books lined the walls. Her desk was organized chaos, stacks of folders, a laptop with 2 external monitors, a coffee mug that said "Nevertheless," she persisted. The letter was 3 pages long. Polite. Professional. Devastatingly precise. It outlined the specific components of the platform I'd authored outside my standard employment duties, the data normalization algorithms I developed in graduate school and refined over years of personal projects, the error handling framework I'd built on weekends, the performance optimization scripts I'd written using machine learning techniques I'd taught myself, the deployment automation tools I'd created on my own hardware. It noted that my employment contract contained ambiguities about work developed on personal time using personal resources, especially work that predated my employment at Century Technologies. It referenced specific case law about intellectual property rights and employee-developed tools. It offered Century Technologies a licensing agreement for these components, $180,000 in back compensation for development work, ongoing royalties equal to 2% of revenue from any clients using the platform, recognition as principal architect with final authority over platform decisions, and a formal agreement preventing future reassignments without mutual consent. And it gave them 72 hours to respond before I withdrew my offer and retained exclusive rights to my proprietary methods. What happens if they refuse? I asked. Diane smiled. Then they try to rebuild without your components. Which means rewriting about 40% of the core functionality, which will take them 8 to 12 months, assuming they even figure out what needs to be rewritten. Meanwhile, the platform continues degrading, clients continue leaving, and their stock price continues dropping. And if they threaten to sue me? Let them. Discovery will be fascinating. We'll subpoena every email, every meeting recording, every commit log. We'll depose Colin about his qualifications. We'll depose Stewart about his decision-making process. We'll show exactly how much value you created and how little recognition you received. It will be expensive for them and embarrassing in ways that matter to a publicly traded company. She handed me the letter. But they won't refuse, Olivia. Because they're desperate. And you're the only person who can save them. Stewart exploded when he received the letter. He called my personal cell phone at 7:30 p.m., his voice shaking with rage. "This is extortion," he shouted. "You don't own that code. You were employed by us when you wrote it. Everything you create belongs to the company." "Some of it, yes," I said calmly, standing on my balcony and watching the sunset. "But not all of it. The data normalization algorithms predate my employment here by 4 years. I developed them during my master's program and continued refining them afterward. The error handling framework came from a personal project I started in 2018. I have Git commits, journal entries, and email exchanges with colleagues proving the timeline." "That's irrelevant. You incorporated it into our platform." "With your permission, yes. But I never signed anything transferring ownership. My employment contract says I grant the company rights to use my work. It doesn't say I transfer ownership. There's a legal difference. This is blackmail. This is business. And right now, your platform is failing because Colin removed the components that depended on my proprietary methods. The authentication system he rebuilt doesn't handle edge cases properly. The database connection pooling he modified causes failures under high load. The monitoring system he simplified doesn't catch the errors that matter. If you'd like to continue using my methods, we can negotiate. If not, you're welcome to rebuild from scratch. But that will take time you don't have. You're bluffing. Test me, Stewart. Let Colin keep making changes. See how long it takes before a major client terminates their contract. See what happens to your quarterly numbers. See what the board says when they realize you sidelined the person who built your most critical system." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end. "You have 72 hours, I said. After that, my offer expires." Century Technologies hired outside consultants. A team of 3 senior engineers from a firm that specialized in system architecture review. They charged $400 per hour, and they spent a full week reviewing the codebase, trying to untangle the dependencies and identify what could be replaced without breaking everything. I watched from a distance as they requested access to my documentation, my repositories, my decision logs, my architecture diagrams. Every request came through formal channels now, ticketing systems, legal CC'd on every email. I declined every request politely. "Please route all inquiries through my attorney, Diane Kruger at Kruger & Associates." The consultants produced a 60-page report. I never saw it officially, but Felix sent me a summary he'd overheard during a meeting. The key findings: rebuilding without Olivia's proprietary components would require rewriting approximately 40% of the core platform functionality. Estimated timeline: 9 to 12 months. Estimated cost: $2.8 million in engineering resources. Risk assessment: high probability of introducing new defects during the rebuild. Several clients were already at risk of contract termination due to current performance issues. Waiting 9 months would almost certainly result in significant client losses. The consultant's recommendation: negotiate with Olivia Rangers immediately. The stock price dipped another 2%. An investor called an emergency board meeting. Colin was quietly reassigned to a strategic advisory role, corporate code for Sidelined with dignity intact. He'd be developing long-term strategy documents that no one would ever read, attending meetings where his opinions didn't matter, slowly watching his influence dissolve.